They thought they could take everything from me with a single vote. One morning, a letter from the HOA landed in my mailbox, bold letters at the top demanding fines so outrageous. It was clear they weren't just after money. They wanted control. Overnight, my peaceful neighborhood turned into a battlefield, where every step I took, every choice I made, was met with threats, rules, and humiliation. But what they didn't know was that I had been quietly preparing my own answer to their power. And when the moment finally came, it left everyone asking, who really hold the power in this neighborhood? When Mark and his family moved into Willow Creek Estates, it felt like they had finally found the kind of neighborhood people dream about. Wide, tree-lined streets, children playing without worry, and neighbors who waved as you drove by. It seemed like a slice of small-town perfection. For years, Mark poured his energy into making their home a place of comfort. Weekends meant barbecues on the back porch. Evenings ended with quiet walks around the lake. And for a while, life felt almost too good to be true. But in communities like this, peace often comes with a price. Behind the manicured lawns and smiling faces was a board of people who lived for rules, and rules that lived being enforced. At first, it was just little things. A warning slipped under the door about trash cans left out too long, or a note scrawled about lawn height. Mark brushed it off, thinking it was just part of living in a managed neighborhood. Yet there was something different about the way this HOA operated, a quiet undercurrent of control, whispers of families who left suddenly after disputes, stories neighbors wouldn't quite finish telling. It was as if everyone knew there was a line you couldn't cross, but no one dared to say where that line was. For Mark, that invisible boundary was about to become painfully clear. What started as a simple life in a beautiful community was about to unravel into a battle that no homeowner ever expects to fight, a battle not for comfo. The first real sign of trouble came on an ordinary Tuesday morning. Mark stepped outside to grab the newspaper, and there it was, a bright orange notice taped to his front door. It claimed his grass was 2 inches too tall. 2 inches. He stared at the paper in disbelief, glancing back at his yard, neatly trimmed, green, and hardly distinguishable from any of his neighbors. Still, the letter was blunt. Cut it immediately or face a $150 fine. Mark thought it had to be some kind of mistake. Maybe the inspector had mixed up addresses. But when he called the number listed, he was met with a voice dripping with condescension. "Sir, the rules are clear. Your lawn does not meet HOA standards. Further noncompliance will result in escalating penalties." There was no room for discussion. That was the beginning. Within weeks, more letters followed. First, it was the lawn. Then, the trash bins. Apparently, he hadn't rolled them back within a precise 2-hour window allowed after pickup. Then came accusations about the fence paint being slightly faded, even though it was only 2 years old. Each notice came a fine attached, and the total started climbing at an alarming rate. Mark wasn't alone. He began hearing whispers from other residents. Families who quietly admitted they, too, had been fined for ridiculous infractions. A garden hose left out, a child's bicycle leaning against the porch, even holiday decorations that were deemed excessive. The HOA didn't just manage, it hunted. Still, Mark tried to comply. He repainted the fence. He kept a timer for garbage day. He cut his grass, so sure it looked scalped. But nothing worked. The notices kept arriving, as if the board had marked him as a target. One evening, he attended an HOA meeting determined to get answers. He sat in a folding chair in the cramped community hall, surrounded by rows of residents who avoided making eye contact. At the front of the room sat the board, a handful of neighbors who spoke with the authority of judges. Mark explained the situation calmly, showed photos of his yard and his fence. But the president of the HOA, a woman named Carol, dismissed him with a smirk. "Rules are rules," she said. "If you can't maintain your property, maybe this isn't the right community for you." The room was silent. No one defended him. And in that moment, Mark realized the board wasn't interested in fairness. They were interested in power. From there, the harassment intensified. Inspectors seemed to linger near his property more often. His mailbox filled with certified letters, each demanding payment. When he refused to pay fines he believed were bogus, late fees were added on top. What had started as a few $100s quickly spiraled into thousands. But the HOA didn't stop at money. They wanted to break him down. One morning, he woke to find a violation notice for unapproved alterations. According to the letter, the small vegetable garden in his backyard was not permitted. Mark had built that garden with his kids, teaching them to grow tomatoes and peppers. Now, the board demanded it be torn out within 10 days or face additional fines. Another letter claimed his driveway had visible cracks and required immediate resurfacing. Mark walked outside and stared at the pavement. There were faint hairline marks, the kind any driveway would have after a few years. Hardly a hazard. But the HOA insisted the repair was mandatory, a repair that would cost thousands of dollars. Each notice felt like a calculated move, designed not just to enforce rules, but to make life unbearable. And still, he wasn't ready for what came next. One Saturday morning, Mark returned from the grocery store to find a bright red sticker on his front window. In bold letters, lien pending. His stomach dropped. The HOA was threatening to take legal action against his home if he didn't pay the mountain of fines. It wasn't just harassment anymore. It was an attempt to seize what he had worked his entire life for. Mark spent that night at the kitchen table, surrounded by crumpled notices and unpaid fines, his hands shaking with anger. How could this be legal? How could a group of neighbors he barely knew hold the power to take his house? Desperation set in. Mark started researching, digging into HOA bylaws, state laws, and court cases. What he found shocked him. The board had been operating in a gray area, twisting vague language in the bylaws to issue arbitrary fines. Worse, they had quietly amended certain rules during low-attendance meetings, making them nearly impossible to challenge. And Mark wasn't their first victim. He found records of past homeowners who had lost their homes under similar circumstances, forced to sell after the HOA drained them with fines and legal fees. The more he uncovered, the angrier he became. This wasn't about maintaining community standards. It was about control, about a small group of people using rules as weapons. But Mark wasn't like the others who had quietly left. He wasn't about to surrender. He began documenting everything. Photos of his lawn, time-stamped. Videos of his driveway. Copies of every notice, every fine, every certified letter. He even started recording HOA meetings. Slowly, he built a case, not just for himself, but against the very system that was crushing his neighbors. And as he prepared his fight, the board tightened its grip. Carol and the others escalated their efforts, calling him out publicly in meetings, mocking his attempts to defend himself. Neighbors grew quieter around him, afraid to get caught in the crossfire. His family, once comfortable in their dream home, now felt like prisoners inside it. Still, Mark pushed forward, knowing the breaking point was near. Because in neighborhoods like Willow Creek, battles with the HOA don't just fade away. They build and build until one side finally breaks. The day of the hearing arrived like a storm Mark could no longer outrun. After months of harassment, endless notices, and threats to seize his home, the HOA had finally pushed the matter into the open. It wasn't just another warning letter slipped into his mailbox. This was the board summoning him before the community, determined to make an example of him. The meeting hall was already packed when Mark walked in, a file of carefully organized evidence clutched in his hand. Rows of metal folding chairs were filled with neighbors, some curious, some wary, many looking away as he passed. At the front, the board sat elevated behind a long table, their expressions tight with smug confidence. Carol, the president, presided at the center like a judge ready to deliver a sentence. Mark took a seat near the front, his heartbeat pounding in his ears. For weeks, he had lived under a constant barrage of fear, the lien, the threats, the possibility of losing his home. But tonight, something was different. He wasn't just there to defend himself. He was there to expose the board for what they were. Carol opened proceedings with a voice sharp and rehearsed. "We are here to address Mr. Thompson's repeated violations of HOA standards and his refusal to comply with community rules." Her words echoed through the hall. A projector flickered to life, showing photos of Mark's property, the same cherry-picked images they had used to justify fine after fine. A single trash bin slightly angled, a faint crack in the driveway. The small garden that had been such a joy for his children. Each infraction laid out like evidence of a crime. Murmurs rippled through the audience. To anyone watching for the first time, it almost looked convincing. That was the board's power. They controlled the narrative, twisting details until they seemed undeniable. But when Carol invited Mark to speak, he stood tall and steady, his voice calm but carrying the weight of months of anger and sleepless nights. He walked in front of the room, placed his thick binder of documents on the podium, and began. Mark laid out the facts. He displayed photos, time-stamped to the very hour, proving his lawn had been in perfect condition. He showed receipts for fence paint, evidence that the cracks in his driveway were cosmetic and harmless. He even pulled out the HOA's own bylaws, highlighting the vague language the board had exploited. Each piece of evidence stripped away their arguments, exposing them for the bullies they were. By the time he was finished, the room had shifted. Neighbors who once sat silent were now leaning forward, murmuring among themselves. Some even nodded in agreement. For the first time, the board looked unsettled. But Mark didn't stop there. He revealed something they hadn't expected. Evidence of past abuses. He displayed meeting minutes where the board had voted to quietly amend rules without notifying homeowners. He shared records of liens filed against families who had been forced to leave. He showed emails he had obtained that hinted at personal grudges being disguised as violations. The room erupted. Carol tried to regain control, her voice cracking as she barked for order. But the tide had turned. The neighbors weren't looking at Mark as the problem anymore. They were looking at the board. The fallout was immediate. Within weeks, several members of the board resigned under pressure. Neighbors, emboldened by Mark's stand, began demanding transparency. A petition circulated calling for new elections. For the first time in years, the stranglehold of the HOA began to loosen. Mark didn't just win his case. He sparked a movement. In the end, the fines were dropped. The lien was removed. His garden stayed exactly where it was, thriving under the sun. The driveway remained untouched because it never needed fixing. And Mark? He walked through his neighborhood not as a target, but as a man who had stood up to a broken system and refused to bow. The impact went further than just his street. Other communities began to take notice. News of his fight spread, inspiring homeowners elsewhere to question their own HOAs. Mark had proven that one person, armed with truth and determination, could stand up against a system designed to intimidate. Life in Willow Creek slowly returned to normal, but the lesson lingered. Peace isn't maintained by silence or fear. It's protected by those willing to fight for it. And every time Mark passed that garden with his kids, he remembered the battle, the night spent in doubt, and the moment he chose to fight back. Because in the end, this wasn't just about a lawn, a fence, or a few cracks in the driveway. It was about a home. And some things are worth fighting for.